This year's celebration of Pride Month has been altered by the pandemic and by turmoil over leadership and vision among activists in the LGBTQ community. But advocates for the community are still working to advance an agenda at the State House addressing needs in health, family relationships, and terms of inclusion. To tell us about the agenda is the Executive Director of MassEquality, Tanya Neslusan. Thank you very much for being with us again, Tanya.
Thank you, Chris, for having me.
Tanya, I want to talk about, I guess you might call it the climate of the moment, whether it's turmoil or recalibration among leadership. And you've been to all these events around the state. How are you processing this, and how is that reflected in the MassEquality agenda at the State House?
Well, I think we really needed to come to a reckoning within our community. We've gone through multiple iterations of, advancing our agenda of equality and civil rights and advancement. And it's really notable that the initial fight for equality was really led by a lot of folks who were kind of left behind in the movement. We had a lot of trans folks who were really at the helm of leadership in the very earliest stages of our movement. We had Black and brown folks who were really leading the charge. And, in order to advance the civil rights of the community, we need to look at the intersectional identities within our community and make sure that our agenda is inclusive of all identities within our community, and that we are not leaving anyone behind anymore. And I think really, it kind of did come to a head last year. But we were able to kind of, in a lot of ways, try and wait and see a little bit, just because of the lockdowns last year, and there weren't Pride celebrations. So, although we have been, making sure that our legislative agendas are inclusive and making sure that what we're fighting for is inclusive, it's really kind of come to a head with things like, Boston Pride, where, we really needed to make sure that we were inclusive all the way down the line as we moved into a space where we were convening in person again. So it wasn't just the behind the scenes work that was inclusive, but really what's up front and in front of the public all the time as well.
Well, one of the issues that's really symptomatic of this, in a way, is legislation that you filed concerning the X factor. In other words, the option away from binary gender identity. For a lot of viewers, that might be a formality or something esoteric, but there are people, I guess this really matters in a very direct, personal way. Explain how that is.
Absolutely. Well, we have ignored the existence, and they have existed since the beginning of time in different cultures, of non-binary gender identities. And having a marker that is not male or female. It is important to honor and respect all of the folks in our community, including non-binary folks, and make sure that their gender identities are respected. Quite frankly, there's not really much of a point in having any gender identity markers on a driver's license or a Massachusetts state ID at all. However, if we are going to have that, then we need to actually have the markers that reflect everyone's identity.
Of course, one of the concerns in a number of the bills that have been filed are about health, and a lot of it about young people's health. Explain why that's such an urgent matter.
Well, we see across the state, and this isn't just Boston. We need to acknowledge that there are varying degrees of healthcare access for people in the LGBTQ community. Trans healthcare is notoriously difficult to navigate and expensive. The same thing with fertility treatments for LGBTQ couples. It's a maze of paperwork. Family building is a maze of paperwork that is largely confusing and frustrating and expensive. We need to make sure that folks are taken care of from the primary care level all the way through behavioral and health and substance abuse, to surgeries and, hormone treatment that they may need, and make sure that those things are obtainable through their covered under their health insurance and obtainable within their provider networks. Because what the access to healthcare looks like in North Adams is going to look very different from what it looks like in North Andover.
Well, one thing you're concerned about in legislation is access to prevention of sexually transmitted infections. And I guess there's a lack of equality there when it comes to maybe preventing HIV. Explain how you want to change that.
Well, one of the bills that we're supporting actually will make PrEP and PEP available to younger folks. And that is really important. We just testified on that because when you are, let's say, 15 years old, the chances that you are going to have in-depth conversations with, your parents about what sexual activities you're involved in are not necessarily great. And also, as a parent, as a heterosexual, presumably a heterosexual parent, you may not even be aware of things like PrEP and PEP, in terms of the prevention of HIV. However, a 15-year-old gay youth may be, and this might be something that saves their life, or saves decades of expensive, treatment, by being able to get at the forefront of prevention, which is also the reason that the Healthy Youth Act is something that we are strongly involved in organizing around, because we need to make sure that young folks have access to the information that they need as well. That the sex ed that's taught in schools is comprehensive and LGBTQIA+ inclusive. Because honestly, parents can only communicate the information that they have. And while it is ideal that your parents would have all of the information and that, children would be most comfortable talking to their parents, we know that's, and I certainly know as the parent of a teenager that is not always, that's not always possible. So we need to make sure that they have the information that they need. And we also want to see PrEP and PEP available over the counter, or by far, to be able to get it, through the pharmacy as well. Because the more accessible you make life-saving medications, the better.
Well, I know we've had sex education in schools for a long time, especially about maybe the biological activity itself. But on the other hand, what about educating young people about what makes a relationship healthy or unhealthy, giving them the framework and the capacity to express when they've been assaulted or abused in some way?
Yeah, and that's absolutely essential, especially at the youngest ages. And at the youngest ages, you aren't necessarily talking about sexual assault, but you're teaching them things like, these are my body parts. You're teaching them things like, I don't have to hug anyone. It's, somebody is only allowed to touch me if I give them consent. And if somebody touches me in an inappropriate way, we should make sure that they have the vocabulary to express exactly what happened. And as they grow and change and, their needs and risks change, then you give them more information. And the hope is that when you start with consent-based education when they're very young, that by the time that they're in high school, they are a lot more comfortable. Because I know, I know, especially growing up as a young girl, there's a lot of pressure to just be nice and to not start a fuss. And it's difficult to know when a line has been crossed if you are not given, the education on the autonomy of your own body as an ongoing comprehensive education plan, both in the homes and at school.
In the LGBTQ community, concerns about mental health, especially among adolescents, it's nothing new, but I think it might have gotten worse during the pandemic. Is there anything you're doing to address that or that's new in some of your legislation?
Well, there is a bill that we are actually testifying on behalf of, I believe this week, regarding putting suicide hotlines on the back of student ID cards in public schools, so that students, when they're in a moment of crisis, will have at least something to look at to make that phone call themselves. We've also worked with various agencies around the state, not in a legislative capacity, but more as an education and outreach capacity. And we're working in terms of trying to pull together resources around that as well.
What about people who are incarcerated? What are you trying to do for them with legislation?
Well, there's a lot that needs to be done there. We want to promote. We are backing two bills, one House side and one Senate side, basically implementing safety procedures to ensure the safety of LGBTQ plus individuals in shared housing, giving them access to HIV prevention and treatment, prohibiting involuntary solitary confinement and punishment for HIV status or disclosure of assault, and facilitating culturally competent programming. Because one thing that often happens in institutional facilities, prison certainly not being the least among them, is that individuals who are LGBTQ are targeted not just by the other residents of the facility, but also by guards and things. And sometimes it's under the guise of protection. We're going to put you in solitary confinement to protect you from getting harmed by other inmates. We're going to write you up for hugging somebody because we don't know if hugging somebody, if you are LGBTQ, is a sexual act, even though two male inmates who are not part of the LGBTQ community might not be written up for the same thing. So it's those kind of things and those kind of cultural competencies that the bill addresses that we really want to, start looking at and start addressing some of these things.
Finally, we should mention, Tanya, that there's a lot more to this agenda, and I imagine you must have something on your website at MassEquality. So if people want to find that, what's the best thing for them to do?
If you visit www.massequality.org, you can see our entire legislative agenda, and keep following us on social media, or sign up for our newsletter for ongoing updates about the status of each of these bills.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you.
This is Tanya Neslusan from MassEquality. We'll have more news in just a moment.